And the tool 2 is that when you think about the brain, you're going to have to expand this accordion of your mind to think in terms of different levels. Let me tell you what this means. This means that, you left your chair. You were like my stand-in volunteer guy. No, but man, you dissed me, man. How do you like that? You see what I feel like wronged. I'm teasing you, right? No, I did have a tiny bit of hurt there. I'm teasing you. Can I still use you even though you're up there? Sure. Okay. So when I think about the levels of your brain, think about your brain in terms of levels. I may think about your DNA because your mom and your dad and your uncle all had addictive disorders. So I got to think about the way that addictive disorders are passed on, which is DNA. I may think in terms of synapses. Synapses obviously is where I work with my serotonin and my Prozac and my naltrexone. I may say, hey, you sound like a guy who may benefit from something that blocks opiates. I may think about you in terms of circuits. Circuits are like the reward circuit and the stress circuit. And I may say, when you're recovering from alcohol, your stress circuit is hot and bothered for weeks. So I'm going to recommend this medication because I know that about addiction. That's a circuit level understanding. And then ultimately this all feeds up to the brain, but I may even go a level up from that because an individual person is one level, but then let's say we talk about your relationships. So you'll see this lady in gray has different relationships, right? I may think about how your brain is affected by your tough relationship at home. I think about that as a brain biologist. I may think about the fact your role as a dad. I may think about the fact that you've got caregiving responsibilities. And I may think about you as a part of this big world with your career or your workplace or things. So a brain-based level of understanding doesn't mean that I don't take other factors into account. You got to just think in terms of levels, and we're going to try to address all of those. But I can address all of those when I'm still thinking about the brain, because bad relationships, guess what we know about bad relationships? They create toxic chemistry for the brain and body. We know that. There's no magic. They create toxic chemistry for the brain and body. So as a brain scientist, I'm still thinking about us as social primates. We glue together and we rub each other and we make nice and we talk and all these things. So brain science is not this reductionistic thing that doesn't understand human social needs. And this level explanation, this is where it gets very complicated. This level understanding means that we have a thing called causal complexity. Say that after me. Causal complexity. So if you to ask me, why am I an addict? Or how did I get this? I'm going to take a deep breath and say, that's a tricky question. Because you come into the world with brains or genes, and then you have some early experiences, and then you have some developmental processes. Maybe you get exposed to stuff. And then you have adult events. Maybe at some point, you get in a situation, and then you have a brain disorder called addiction, and it's very complicated to sort it out, isn't it? What's the cause? It's not even really a coherent way to ask a question. That's tool 2, is levels. Tool 3 is the iceberg. This is a version of tool 1. When I'm sitting with my friend who's now abandoned me, causing hurt feelings, emotional pain, I'm going to ride that joke until it dies, so bear with me. I'm both thinking about what he's saying and what he's thinking, but our conscious minds are like the tip of an iceberg. Our conscious minds are like the tip of an iceberg. I'm not going Freudian on everybody. What that means, as far as I know from my observation of myself, and I've spent a fair amount of time paying attention to what goes on in this thing, as far as I know, this thing is a small part of the deal. That there are forces and factors and stuff that burble up and make thoughts come up that we're just not aware of. And we're very married to this thing, but the tip of the iceberg is the tip of the iceberg. We're just not always. For example, I'll tell you about a fun study funded by your tax dollars. 2 professors went to a strip joint, and the experiment that they were doing was the amount of tips that strippers got. These are your tax dollars, don't look at me. And what they found was that when a woman, not on birth control, was at her, the time when her eggs released, that she got more tips. Now, how is that? Do you think the men that gave more tips thought, she just ovulated? I think it's a good time to tip more. How do women that live in the same dorm room synchronize their menses? There's so many factors that we just don't understand that influence our thoughts and feelings and choices. And that's part of being a brain scientist, is understanding that iceberg. Here's the iceberg that the Titanic hit. It's funny, the guy who noticed there was a red smear on it from a ship hitting it, and then the rest is history, right? So one of the hands in my two-hand model, one hand is your mind and your humanity, the other hand is under the water. You just can't know what's going on in your brain right now. You can't. It's impossible. And neither do I necessarily, but I know there's something. And I know that if I change some things about how the brain works, then I can change some things about how the mind works and how choices are made. This is the whole field of experimental psychology. We've proved beyond a reasonable doubt that if I put you in an experiment and I give you this chemical and that chemical and this chemical and expose you to this stimuli and that stimuli, I can change the choices you make and you won't be aware. That's just the data. That's why when a patient asks me, should I drink near beer? To me, they need a little education, which Jeff is going to give them about the way the brain responds to stimuli. You have to understand how the brain responds to stimuli to understand why that's not a good idea. You got to understand that, because a lot of this is under the ice, is under the surface. So for the people who are really into LifeRing, you can ask me, I'll send you these slides. I made up this little thing about the addict self and the sober self just for fun. The funny thing is, these things coexist in the same brain, right? So the same brain is kicking up sober self and addict self at different times. It's just different ways the brain is working. So in the addict self, I think that on the upper left, there's very little conscious awareness of goals or outcomes beyond the immediate future. You get rationalization because that's what human brains do. There may be a sense of control, but it's false. And on the underneath addict self from the bottom up, the goal is to reduce short-term distress, increase short-term pleasure, and I ignore others for the most part. That is, I'm not concerned about how my behavior affects others. There's repetitive or compulsive behaviors. And down in the lower right, this is a fancy term. Please don't pay attention to it, but it's important because incentive salient circuits are the dopamine system. Everybody's heard of the dopamine system in addiction. If you are interested in addiction, you should have the word dopamine in your vocabulary because that drives a lot of the behaviors of the addict self. The sober self is different. The sober self has awareness or appraisal of life-affirming goals or outcomes. That's what these guys do all day in their groups, is they ask people to reflect and think and do all those things that the addict self doesn't do in any kind of honest way, because that's just not the way that part works. So you try to engage that part, and I'm thinking, as a brain scientist, when you say you came back from group, I'm thinking, oh, down in the lower right, your incentive salient circuits are not firing, your prefrontal circuits are firing. It's not fun to go to meetings and think about change and all this stuff. That doesn't feel good at all, but it may help you get where you really want to go if you do those things. So if anybody wants these, I just made these for fun. Anybody like Clouseau? Yeah, right. So sometimes, this cracks me up. So Clouseau, who's this crack detective, is outside a bank. And he sees this man with a minky. And he's accosting this man with a minky because he's practicing without a license. Behind Clouseau, there's this whole robbery going on. And he's just unaware. In fact, one of the robbers drops his bag and Clouseau says, oh, here you go. And he's accosting. So many times when I'm talking to you now, my false friend. But if you're in lasting recovery, I'm hearing your conscious mind talking, and I'm really not listening to what you're saying, to be honest, because I'm not going to pay attention to the minky. Because behind all of this is a chaotic last couple of years, right? If you're coming in for addiction treatment, I've got this robbery going on behind, and you're saying, I don't know if I have an addiction, and it's just the monkey. Because up here is not where the action is. The action is down here. And you have a brain disorder where when you put the alcohol molecule in, you get crazy life out. But the conscious mind is just bup, 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 bup. It's fine, but I'm not paying attention because I'm better than Clouseau. I'm not going to pay attention to the minky. That was goal number 3. Cognitive tool number 3 was the fact that Our minds are like an iceberg, and what you see up here is not the whole story. Now, another great thing about groups, have you ever seen in a group that someone says blah, 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 and everybody else in the room, their horse manure meter goes off, right? So what is that? Not everybody shares your blind spots. So everybody's like, oh, that's horse manure. Yeah, my kids may watch this video, so I got to watch my okay. And how would that happen? Because that's the monkey, right? Now you actually believe the horse manure, but it's horse manure. It doesn't fit with the robbery. Okay.